about is the importance of sleep. And here to talk with today, again, is Dr. Christopher Kline. He also works at the University of Pittsburgh. He has a PhD in exercise science as well as a PhD in exercise science with applied physiology. He's here to talk about the effects with sleep and obesity. So help me in welcoming back Dr. Christopher Kline.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Prins, to Grove City for bringing me back again. So, as alluded to, I was here last year to talk about sleep and athletic performance, which is one of the areas that I focus on at Pitt. But then one of the areas that I was actually brought on as faculty at Pitt within the Physical Activity and Weight Management Research Center was how sleep may be involved in body weight regulation and weight maintenance. So the only area we haven't covered is sleep and exercise, which is sort of my area of main expertise. So maybe that can be next year. I don't know. I look around here and I see a bunch of young, healthy, fit, not overweight individuals. So the content of this talk may not be as directly relevant for you guys because we're really going to be focusing the next 40 minutes or so on really the relevance of sleep to warding off weight gain and preventing obesity. So hopefully this will be more relevant to clients you work with or as you get older like me and activity levels go down, your metabolic rate goes down a little bit, and you eat at your kids' favorite restaurants a little bit too often. So we're going to go over 4 different areas over the next 40 minutes or so. First, we're going to talk about just the basic associations that we initially saw linking poor sleep with obesity, those initial clues that we saw that there might be a linkage here. Next, we'll go over some of the experimental evidence that really try to probe what mechanisms are really at play here. Then we'll move on to the areas that I've been most involved with in terms of, in the context of a normal, standard behavioral weight loss intervention, what role does sleep play, if any? And then finally, sort of the holy grail in this area of research, what happens if we try to improve someone's sleep who's trying to lose weight? Does that actually impact their weight loss? So first, starting off with the epidemiology. So I always like to start off with this because at its most simplistic conceptualization, body weight regulation is really a balance between energy intake and energy expenditure. And most commonly, the behaviors we think of are exercise and dietary intake. And by far, those are the most important factors involved in maintaining energy balance and preventing weight gain or weight loss. But we know now that this energy balance model is much more complicated. So this is a slide courtesy of one of what I consider the legends in exercise science, Dr. Claude Bouchard. He's done a lot in exercise and genetics. So he's showing here physical environment, social environment, biological, behavioral influences on energy balance. This slide, though, is a few years old. So at a minimum, it shows you just the wide number of influences that we have on energy balance. So it's not just as simple as calorie in, calorie out. But you'll notice here, Dr. Bouchard did not have sleep on it. And hopefully, about 35 minutes from now, you will agree with me that sleep should be on. If he did update this slide, sleep would also be on this. So early on, in the field of sleep epidemiology, one of the earliest sort of observations that were made was this sort of parallel development between, in the last 40 years or so, the rapid rise in obesity and weight gain in U.S. society, but also the concurrent rise in insufficient sleep. So you guys have undoubtedly seen this BMI curve, the obesity curve, those CDC maps in which every state now is like super dark colors because there's a high rate of obesity in every state. Well, similar plots could be made for insufficient sleep duration. So shown here are U.S. public health data sets that chronicle from 1980 to 2010 the rise in adult prevalence of obesity and short sleep duration, which we usually will characterize as 6 or less hours per night. So you can see here broadly parallel increases over time. Obesity is a little bit steeper, but this is what really got the field of sleep research initially interested in weight regulation, obesity, metabolic function. And obviously, just showing that two independent variables seem to be trending in the same direction is not sufficient for any sort of causality claims, but it did really start the conversation. What's happened over the last 10 to 20 years is we've started to observe in large-scale prospective cohort studies, so studies in which we take people who are not obese at the beginning, we study them for 5, 10 years optimally, and we see after 5 or 10 years how many people became obese. And we categorize them based upon their baseline sleep duration. And what you can see here are 2 different meta-analyses that have characterized either children or adults and the relationship between insufficient sleep and their risk of developing obesity later on. So you can see pretty much across the board, so these are relative risks that are shown here. A relative risk of 1 indicates really no increased risk, according to whatever variable you're looking at. But shown here, you can see that the relative risks for obesity pretty much across the board are at a minimum 1.4 or higher, which when you interpret that, that means that people who get too little sleep at various stages in life, they're at least 40% more likely to become obese. And that's a very strong, that's a high magnitude value, almost just as high as insufficient activity. What's also notable here is that you see that sleep isn't just important for adults. It's also very important throughout childhood. Even, I was actually a little bit surprised when I prepared this slide because a lot of the most consistent evidence between sleep and obesity does come from, does result from childhood cohorts. So kids getting enough sleep is a really big public health issue these days. So, just to reorient you guys, it is the case, though, that the amount of sleep we need differs according to where we are in our lifespan. So, this is the most recent iteration of sleep duration recommendations put out by the National Sleep Foundation. And what you can see is that across the lifespan, starting from newborn all the way to older adult, you need different amounts of sleep according to what age you are. And in general, your sleep need will decrease with increasing age, but no matter how old you get, 7 hours a night seems to be the floor below which you start to see impairments in just functioning, health, and as I'll show you here, metabolic health. But it's important to remember that sleep duration is not the end-all be-all. You can get adequate duration and still have pretty terrible sleep. So this conceptualization of sleep health is relatively new. By far the most research has been conducted on sleep duration, but there's an increased appreciation now for other dimensions of sleep that also seem to be important for optimal health. So obviously we have duration here, but also bed-wake regularity. Going to bed at the same time, getting out of bed at the same time each morning. I know that's probably not popular amongst college kids, but weekend to weekdays, trying to have your bedtimes and your wake times be pretty similar. Also, the timing of your sleep is important. 8 hours of sleep obtained between noon and 8 p.m. is not as restorative as 8 hours of sleep between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Your body is just naturally set up to sleep at night. Efficiency of your sleep is important. So you can get 10 hours of sleep, but you'd be wakened up 4 or 5 times a night, or you can get a more consolidated, less fragmented bout of sleep, which is much better. And there's also this self-reported, this perception about sleep that's very important that we can't really quantify with anything else. So high-quality sleep is very important. So just feeling refreshed, feeling in the morning once you wake up like, oh, I got a good night's sleep and now I'm ready to tackle the day. And then lastly, daytime alertness is important, which typically comes as a consequence of these other factors, but has also been shown to be an independent factor predicting health. So these are all dimensions that everyone will experience. So healthy sleep is not simply the absence of a sleep disorder. But we also need to keep under consideration that there are many different sleep disorders that could impact one's health as well. So to me, the 3 biggest ones are sleep apnea, insomnia, and something called restless legs syndrome. So like I said, the majority of research has been focused on this, on how insufficient sleep impacts obesity risk. But there have been a few studies that have started to look at these other dimensions of sleep health. So we don't have time to go into each of these studies individually, but just know that there is evidence suggesting that independent of how long you sleep, going to bed and getting out of bed at the same time every day, that's been related to obesity, or people who have highly irregular sleep schedules, I should say, increases your risk for obesity. Having very late timing of your sleep, so going to bed at like 1 a.m., waking up at 10, that's associated with greater obesity risk. Having fragmented sleep, having poor quality sleep, and then being sleepy during the day, each of those have been shown, in individual studies at least, to also be linked with obesity. And I also did want to point out that it's not just a one-way direction, one-way relationship between poor sleep leading to obesity. Obesity can also exacerbate poor sleep. So shown here on the left is the prevalence of a sleep disorder called obstructive sleep apnea. Are you guys familiar with that disorder? Okay, so it's basically a disorder in which you, when you're asleep at night, even though you're trying to breathe, you'll go through periods of the night in which you pause your breathing for at least 10 seconds or more. People with severe sleep apnea, so this is the prevalence of moderate to severe sleep apnea. A person with moderate sleep apnea, this happens 15 times every hour of sleep. And that's associated with numerous cardiovascular and metabolic consequences. What you can see here, though, is that sleep apnea is relatively rare for people who are normal weight. Very low prevalence. But the prevalence dramatically increases as one becomes more obese. And this is one of these sleep disorders in which obesity predisposes to the disorder, but then once you have the disorder, that leads to further weight gain. So it's a vicious feed-forward cycle in which many adults with obstructive sleep apnea sort of get caught into. But also, it's not just sleep apnea. The prevalence of insomnia symptoms, so just difficulty going to sleep, difficulty staying asleep, or waking up too early and not really wanting to get up that early. Those sort of symptoms are highly prevalent in individuals who are overweight or obese. And you can see here just a general increasing dose-response relationship. The heavier you are, the more likely you are to experience significant insomnia symptoms. And in general, in adults who are obese, their sleep is of lower quality. They get less deep sleep or slow wave sleep, the most restorative stage of sleep. Their sleep is more fragmented, more broken up, and they're sleepier during the day. So it is clearly a bidirectional relationship. So just going to go over a few different sort of characteristic studies that have really started to probe why are we seeing these epidemiologic associations between too little sleep and obesity risk. One of the first studies, like I said, this is research that's only been going on for the last 15 to 20 years or so. Really the landmark study that started off experimental manipulation or exploration into this topic was conducted in Chicago, in which they had just about 10 healthy young adults, probably 10 guys in here could have been the subjects, in which they had them sleep in the lab for 2 days, and they allowed them to sleep for 10 hours a night for those 2 days, and then they had them come in a few weeks later, sleep in the lab for 2 days again, but they only let them sleep for 4 hours this time. And they measured a whole host of physiological variables. These are just a few of the results. They probably published 10 or 15 papers off of this. But some of the most landmark findings from this study were that when you restrict a person's sleep, their hunger levels increase pretty much across the day. It's not restricted to a single time of day. And their overall appetite levels increase dramatically. So that sounds pretty common sense, right? But up until this time, we had no evidence that this was actually occurring. They published a few years later from the same study, what are some of the neurohormonal appetite regulators? What's happening with them according to sleep restriction? And as you can see here, leptin, which is a satiety hormone, signals to your brain that really you've had enough to eat. That signal was blunted when your sleep is restricted. And then ghrelin, which is a sort of an appetite promoting hormone, that was significantly increased with restricted sleep. So not only are we expressing it in terms of our thoughts and our cravings and appetite and hunger, but there's a neurohormonal basis sort of underlying this increased appetite that we see with too little sleep. So we have these hormonal markers that are increased. The next level was looking at the brain. What's going on in the brain when we don't get enough sleep? So you'll see here, these are all very similar types of trials, but for this, they brought in 25 or so normal weight adults, and they had them come in for 2 different times. Each subject came in twice. Under one condition, they were sleep restricted. On the other condition, they got sufficient sleep. And they did this for 6 consecutive days. And at the end of those 6 days, they put them into an fMRI scanner. And functional MRI scanners basically allow a researcher to just see what's going on in the brain, what brain regions are being activated in response to specific stimuli. And for this study, they showed pictures of food, so like a donut, a slice of pizza, carrots, probably not carrots, or non-food pictures like birds, a baseball mitt, just innocuous items. What they found was that under conditions of sleep restriction, the brain absolutely lit up in specific areas that were related to food craving, desiring food as like a reward, areas that have been implicated in having preference for pleasurable activities, and also areas were lit up that indicates lack of self-control, basically. So this is just a broad summary here, because lots of studies have been conducted in this area now. So areas like the prefrontal cortex, thalamus, insula, these all just lit up like a light bulb under sleep restriction, but not really under normal sleep conditions. But the broad summary here is that when you're sleep deprived, you are more susceptible to having these extreme food cravings. Your preference isn't for carrots. It's for more of the calorie-dense foods. And you have less self-control to ward off those cravings. So we have now hormonal markers, your brain is dysregulated, and we also have your tissues being dysregulated. So lots of studies have looked at sleep restriction and metabolic function at the tissue level. I decided to show these two studies, though, because instead of restricting sleep, they actually took the relatively non-conventional approach of allowing these participants, they allowed them, I think, 8 hours of sleep per night, but they were really cruel in that for this one, I think they had like a rumble machine underneath the mattress, and they would just disturb their sleep quality all night long. I think it was actually as they were getting into deeper sleep, they just rumbled it so they wouldn't get deep sleep. And then for this one, they used acoustic tones that as soon as they got into deeper sleep, they would progressively have an auditory tone that would basically not wake them up, but move them into a shallower stage of sleep. So they got 8 hours of sleep, but it wasn't as restorative. So this is getting more at the sleep health aspects. But you can see here lots of fancy measures of insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance here. But broadly speaking, just 2 nights of fragmented sleep or 3 nights of shallow sleep, non-restorative sleep, led to significant decreases in insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance. So our brains are messed up, our tissues are messed up, and our hormonal markers are messed up. But what about behavior? So this is another one of those controlled studies in which they actually had people stay in a calorimetry room for 5 days. And they came in for 2 different conditions. This is sounding familiar now, hopefully for you guys. 9 hours of sleep per night or 5 hours of sleep per night for 5 consecutive days. And because they stayed in this room calorimeter, energy expenditure could be objectively evaluated for those 5 days. So what they found was that when you sleep less, you burn more calories over a 24-hour period. That should make sense, right? Sleep is literally the most sedentary activity you can do. So if you're staying up 4 more hours per day, you're going to burn more calories. So sleep should not be associated with weight gain in theory, right? What happens is that your food intake more than offsets that slight increase in caloric expenditure from staying up more. So this is 5 days, but around 280 calories were taken in more under the sleep loss condition, but only about 150 calories extra were burned from the sleep loss condition. So a net caloric imbalance of around 100 calories per day. So over 5 days, it didn't manifest in terms of weight loss, but long term, this would have definite implications in terms of weight gain. What I thought was the most interesting, though, was they broke down energy intake according to specific meals. And you can see here that breakfast, if anything, people who slept less, they actually ate a smaller breakfast than in the long sleep condition. Lunch, dinner didn't matter, daytime snacks didn't matter. The culprit, the dreaded late night snacking. So I'm sure you guys don't have a problem with this, but what they found in this study and then in subsequent studies, not only is the craving for post-dinner snacks increased in the sleep loss condition, the type of food craving is also much different. So donuts, chips, pizza, it's no one's asking for celery and dip at midnight. So I worked in a sleep lab for about 2 years at the end of my PhD. So I was working, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 3 nights a week. I had never, over those 2 years, I ate more Do you guys have Krispy Kreme donuts around here? What's that? No? Well, it's probably a good thing, but I never ate more Krispy Kreme glazed donuts than in those 2 years than I have in the rest of my life. What the diet I had and the rest of us technicians had was absolutely horrible. I actually probably still have some weight around my belly from that. But so your behavior changes, and that makes sense because our hormonal markers are different, and our brain reactivity to food cues is very different under sleep loss conditions. But also, we become less active under sleep loss conditions. So this is a study actually done out in the field, but they had people undergo two conditions, either 8.5 hours per night or 5.5 hours per night for 7 days. And you can see here that under sleep loss conditions, there's this gradual shift from higher intensity activity to more sedentary activity. You can see increases in sedentary and decreases in both light and MVPA. The scariest thing is that this seems to be most pronounced among people who are habitually exercise. So if you're normally active under conditions of sleep loss, it's the exercisers who will decrease their activity to a much greater extent. So really, we have both behavioral and physiological mechanisms that can possibly explain why we're just not sleeping, why we're at greater risk for obesity under short sleep conditions. So we're not going to go through this individually, but this just shows you that there's multiple pathways through which insufficient sleep or poor sleep health really can be manifesting in increased body weight or increased body fat storage. So moving on to weight loss intervention. So if we have a person who's desiring to lose weight and they go through a relatively run-of-the-mill weight loss intervention, what role does sleep play? Does sleep matter? So one of the coolest studies, I think, was conducted, again, in Chicago, in which it was a relatively controlled study in which they made the individuals stay at Chicago for 2 weeks at a time. In one condition, they allowed them to sleep 8.5 hours per night. In the other condition, under restricted sleep conditions. And for both conditions, though, they maintained the same diet. And it was really only a caloric restriction intervention, no physical activity component, because they were pretty much holed up in a laboratory the whole time. But they restricted the diet to 90% of one's baseline resting metabolic rate, so a pretty severe diet. But again, same across conditions. What they found was that after only 2 weeks, both groups lost approximately the same amount of weight. 3 kilograms were lost after only 2 weeks of time. So again, this was a pretty severe caloric restriction. So on the surface, they're losing weight. It doesn't matter if they were under sleep loss or sleep normal conditions. What was disturbing, though, was that when they broke it down into the compartments of weight that were lost, under sleep loss conditions, the weight that was lost was fat-free mass and not fat mass. And other studies since then have actually come out with very similar findings, suggesting that even if individuals lose a similar proportion of weight, it's much less fat loss if you're under sleep loss conditions, indicating some sort of the body is trying to hang on to these energy stores if at all possible. So some of the research that we've been doing at Pitt, we've been wanting to look at multiple components of sleep and see how that really impacts subsequent weight loss. So this is a study. It involved around 300 adults, and they went through just a normal weight loss intervention that focused on diet and physical activity. And it was a pretty simple assessment of sleep. We used something called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and what that can provide to us is measurement of both sleep duration and sleep quality. And what we found, though, was when we characterized adults based upon their sleep at baseline, only one group stood out from the others. And that was the group that reported insufficient sleep, but also poor quality sleep. Every other combination you could see here, they lost approximately the same amount of weight. But for that relatively small group, it was around 15% of the sample, who reported less than 6 hours a night and just having overall poor quality sleep, they lost dramatically less weight at 6 months, and by 12 months, they were actually regaining weight. So again, showing that it's not just sleep duration. There may be an important component provided by other indices of sleep health. There's also this issue of what is your circadian physiology? Now, we didn't have time to get into it here, but have you guys heard of the terms like morning lark, night owl, stuff like that? So most college kids tend to be a little bit more on the evening chronotype, more night owl. Well, it turns out there is a genetic component to that. And in this study, some Spanish researchers took a large sample of adults who were going through just a normal weight loss intervention, and she genotyped them according to a specific genetic polymorphism called a clock gene. There's multiple clock genes, but she chose a specific one here. And what she found was that by about 14 weeks into the intervention, the two groups differed in their weight loss response to just a standard behavioral weight loss intervention. And for these individuals, they could be sort of physiologically or phenotyped as having shorter sleep, more night owls, but also having higher levels of that plasma ghrelin, sort of the appetite-promoting hormone, and they couldn't adhere to the dietary prescription quite as well. So there also is this circadian component that could be vitally important to weight loss efforts. And lastly, in terms of what we've been doing in terms of characterizing the importance of sleep in weight loss interventions, this is a study that we did in collaboration with some colleagues in nursing, and we took a relatively small sample of adults, 114, and we measured every single participant's sleep apnea at the beginning of the study. So these were all individuals who were overweight or obese. None of them, though, claimed they had sleep apnea or knew they had sleep apnea. What we found, though, when we tested them, was that over 50% had at least mild sleep apnea. Again, remember from an earlier slide, the prevalence of sleep apnea goes up dramatically among overweight and obese individuals. And sort of disturbingly, we found that individuals who had sleep apnea at baseline lost significantly less weight than those without sleep apnea. So you may think that 2% isn't much, but believe me, for someone who's striving to lose weight, 2% is a huge deal. And in research terms, I actually had a colleague gently request that we rerun the analyses because she didn't think this size of a magnitude was plausible. And what's really interesting here is that individuals who have sleep apnea are commonly recommended by their physicians for initial treatment to lose weight. So if you have sleep apnea, lose weight, that'll likely make your sleep apnea less severe. Well, what we're finding is that the very presence of their sleep apnea makes them less likely be able to lose weight. So it's a vicious cycle here. And when we looked at what was actually happening with these individuals, we found that it's not like they weren't trying to adhere as well. They were attending the same number of sessions, but they couldn't adhere as well to the caloric restriction, and they also didn't increase their activity levels as much as those without sleep apnea. So we didn't have any physiological markers of like ghrelin or leptin, but our analyses really did show that the behaviors seemed to suffer in people with sleep apnea. And then in a separate analysis, like I said, there was about half of the sample that had sleep apnea in this study. Well, when we looked across all the individuals, regardless of their sleep apnea status, behaviors are impaired according to poor sleep at baseline. So this is the amount of time you're awake at night after first falling asleep. And you can see here that over 12 months, people who weren't awake too much at night, so they had pretty consolidated sleep at night, they were able to reduce their amount of time spent sedentary by around an hour a night. But those who were awake quite a bit, they actually became even more sedentary over the course of the 12 months. And then in terms of dietary behaviors, one of the key questionnaires that we administer is something called Barriers to Healthy Eating. Really indicates what sort of difficulties they have to implementing a healthy diet. And a reduction is actually an improvement or reducing the amount of barriers. You can see that the only people who really improved that score were people who had relatively consolidated sleep at baseline. So again, pointing out that really behaviors may be important for people with poor sleep attempting to lose weight. So lastly, in the last couple minutes here, I did want to show you the preliminary evidence of studies that have tried to take the evidence that we've already accumulated, the associations, the mechanisms, and the evidence that we're starting to accumulate at Pitt, and see if we can optimize weight loss by simply improving sleep. So not much research has happened in this area, first off, but I can tell you the available evidence is not super compelling. So this was a small study in which they took participants in a primary care setting, and they had them go through either just a basic run-of-the-mill weight loss intervention, or they added sleep to the intervention on top of just the standard intervention that was delivered to both groups. What they found was that sleep improved in both groups over the course of the 12 weeks, but that enhanced intervention group did seem to lose a little bit more weight than those who received the standard intervention. So this is really the best evidence we have right now, quite frankly. And it's a small sample. I didn't put it up here, but I think attrition was over 50%. So this really is not a strong foundation really to build recommendations on. So this is really trying to improve just sleep quality. What about sleep duration? We have, around 30% of the population gets insufficient sleep, so this would most logically be your perfect public health target. So you have a high proportion of the population and a clear health benefit to improving or extending sleep duration. This was a study funded by the NIH, actually by an internal team at NIH, in which they went all in for this. They wanted to have a definitive study from the beginning. So they recruited a large sample, 150 adults, and they were all short sleeping, obese adults who didn't have these sort of confounding factors that could be explaining why they're getting too little sleep. And they had them go through a 12-month intervention in which they tried to get them to increase their sleep to around 7.5 hours per night, or they received basically the control condition in which they just maintain their current sleep. And then after 12 months, they would go into an effectiveness phase, which lasted an additional 3 years. So if this study had been successful, you would have heard about this probably 10 times over. But the results have never been published. Thankfully, there's increased transparency in research now, so all studies really need to actually register themselves before they're conducted. And you could actually look online and see that this study was completed back in 2013, but when they analyzed the data, they basically couldn't get people to sleep longer. And even in their preliminary analyses, they didn't see changes in metabolic parameters, changes in weight. So this really put a damper on this area of research for a couple of years. There are now some studies that show on a short-term level, so 2 to 4 weeks in duration, that we now have learned how to maybe increase sleep duration, but those studies have been so short that we're not seeing any changes in body weight. So this still a lot of people still think there's potential in this area, though. And lastly, treating obstructive sleep apnea. Like I said before, if you have untreated sleep apnea, you lose less weight than someone who doesn't have sleep apnea. The standard therapy for sleep apnea, though, is something called CPAP. Any of you guys who knows anyone who has sleep apnea is being treated for it. It's basically wearing a mask on your face, and that delivers a constant stream of air, which prevents your upper airway from collapsing during the night. So it prevents any stoppages in breathing. Sounds lovely, doesn't it? So CPAP wear has been shown to improve a variety of metabolic parameters, so glucose tolerance, blood pressure, cardiovascular health, but it also leads to some mild weight gain in some studies. So if you think about it, if you're constantly breathing more heavily and waking up a little bit during the night, that does increase caloric expenditure during the nighttime period. So what we found is that when we give a person CPAP and they sleep better, they actually burn less calories over 24 hours, which over time, and especially in collaboration with, we don't see any change in their diet or activity, eventually leads to mild weight gain in these people. But nevertheless, there still was some thought that maybe just treating their sleep apnea, if someone's trying to lose weight, does treating their sleep apnea actually improve or augment their weight loss? And the answer is probably not. So this study was a pretty definitive study, published in the New England Journal of Medicine a couple years ago. You can see that 24 weeks of intervention in which they received a CPAP only, went through a standard weight loss group, weight loss treatment, or they received CPAP and weight loss. CPAP, like I said before, led to mild weight gain. But really, weight loss only versus weight loss plus CPAP, at 8 weeks and at 24 weeks, we really don't see any difference. So pretty disappointing results here, but at least we know that CPAP plus weight loss doesn't really blunt any weight loss compared to just weight loss only. So that's the state of, pretty much the state of the evidence right now. Broadly, we can say that there's an abundance of association-based evidence, epidemiologic evidence, between poor sleep and obesity. That's pretty clear. We also think we pretty much have it down in terms of what are these physiological mechanisms and behavioral mechanisms that could be linking insufficient sleep with altered energy balance. We have a smaller body of evidence, but still relatively consistent, that poor sleep really leads to blunted or worsened outcomes when people are attempting to lose weight. But the evidence in terms of translating all this into actionable interventions that we can do to improve weight loss, the research really just isn't there. So I'll close with just one slide. We are, at Pitt, we are really trying to wrap our heads around, if we were to design a study that we think would be the definitive study that would test whether improving sleep can improve weight loss, what would it be? So I'll close with just the recommendations that we're floating around right now that we think, if anything works, it's going to be this. So first off, you need to screen for potential sleep disorders. So like I said before, many adults who are overweight or obese may not know that they have sleep apnea. And that's important to get treated, if possible. The next thing is to emphasize not only getting sufficient duration of sleep, but really being more holistic in emphasizing just optimizing their sleep health. So again, that does, of course, cover adequate duration, but also regular bed and wake times, having consolidated sleep, minimizing the amount of disruptions or awakenings that could occur during the night, having it occur at relatively normal times. So nighttime sleep being better than daytime sleep. And then just emphasizing sleep quality. there's many little things you can do that can optimize sleep quality. And lastly, I wasn't sure I should even mention this because we didn't have time to really talk about it, but one of the hottest areas in the sleep and circadian field right now is indicating that the timing, not only the content of what we eat and the timing of and the amount of exercise we do, but the timing that we take in food and that we are physically active could have a variety of health implications, but specifically here could be impacting our metabolic health and specifically risk for weight gain. I'm still trying to get a lot of people in my department to believe this, but in the sleep field, it is pretty much a given that a calorie taken in at, say, 2 p.m. is not handled the same as a calorie taken in at 2 a.m. Just the body handles it more differently, and the body is less well set up to metabolize food at sort of off-peak hours. So there's not much hard evidence in humans to really substantiate those claims, but in animal research it's pretty clear that metabolic health differs greatly across the 24-hour day. So one of the areas that we're looking at is trying to basically have a weight loss intervention that conceptualizes weight loss behaviors according to how it impacts one's biological clock, their circadian system. So we competed against a bunch of other people at Pitt. We have these like research competitions. Dr. Nagel's group did much better than we did. But it was this, we called the intervention clockwork, which we thought was pretty cool. But we got to the semis, but we did not get to the finals. But that did not deter us, and we're continuing to work on that and potentially get an NIH grant for it. So that's all I have. I did want to make a shameless plug, though, that if anyone is interested in this area of research, we are starting up a couple new studies, and we would always welcome smart, motivated grad students. So please let me know if you're interested in learning more about Pitt. So with that, I'll take some questions.